Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Laura, I'm a postdoc at the IBA project. And as Aiko said, I'm going to go a bit more into the question of what do they do. I'm going to talk about one of my projects, which was on the ecosystem functions of insects in Sweden and Madagascar. So after the previous talks, of course, it became super clear that insects are very diverse, and all these different kinds of insect species are also fulfilling very important roles within our ecosystems. So just to give you a few examples of the many functions that they do, of course, insects are very important pollinators, as you probably all know. They also eat plants. It is called herbivory. They disperse seeds of plants. They predate, for example, on other insects. And they are also very important decomposers, so they're important for the nutrient cycling within ecosystems. And if you would want to have an overall picture of how well is an ecosystem functioning, then you can sum up all the different functions in an ecosystem, taking into account how often these or how fast these ecosystem functions are happening. And this is metric is called ecosystem multifunctionality. So as I said, it kind of gives you this overall picture of how well does this ecosystem function. So to give you some examples, here you see an ecosystem with very many ecosystem functions that are happening a lot. This ecosystem has a high ecosystem multifunctionality, whereas in this ecosystem there's fewer functions and they're maybe happening a bit less. So this ecosystem has a low ecosystem multifunctionality. So we'll come back to this concept later on, but then you know what I'm talking about, because it's a bit of a complicated word. And of course, these functions are not happening in isolation. They're placed in an environment with all different kinds of influences. So of course, there's the climate, the temperature, precipitation regimes that are influencing these functions. There's landscapes, different kinds of vegetation covers that can dictate which functions are happening where. And of course, then we have the biodiversity, in our case, the insects that determine which functions are happening where and how much of those functions are happening. And of course, we all know that we live in a rapidly changing world with climate change. Humans are transforming landscapes. There's a biodiversity crisis, so now it's more important than ever to know how these factors are influencing the functioning of our ecosystems. So we wanted to answer these two questions with this project. First of all, how are ecosystem functions spread in space across Sweden and Madagascar? So basically, which functions are happening where? And then once we know that, how are these functions affected by climate, landscape, and biodiversity? So here you can see the functions that we measured in Sweden. So as mentioned before, we had a big group of dedicated volunteers spread across Sweden, and at about 170 locations here, they did these experiments on herbivory, pollination, predation, seed dispersal, and microbial decomposition. Same for Madagascar. They had experiments on herbivory, predation, seed dispersal, decomposition, and microbial decomposition at 50 locations around Madagascar. And as Andrea showed, the logistics of doing fieldwork in Madagascar are of course much more challenging. So this was a very impressive work done by a group of dedicated field workers. So here you can see part of the group that was involved with this, with Tsiri as one of the main people leading these experiments, and also Dimbi that you can see here at the Malaise trap. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention, of course, at each of these sites where we did the ecosystem function experiments, there was also a Malaise trap to monitor insect biodiversity, to relate those two. Then moving on to the results. So how are ecosystem functions spread across space? Here you can see the results for Sweden. So on these different maps, you can see the spatial distribution of each of these functions on herbivory, predation, dispersal, microbial decomposition, and pollination. And the more yellow the color is, the more of this function is happening at a certain place. And the more blue, the less of this function is happening at that place. And the squares are representing the sites where these experiments were done. So as a general trend, which was not completely unexpected, we saw that for some of the functions, especially predation dispersal, we saw, and also a bit microbial decomposition, we saw that in the north these functions were happening less than in the south. Then for ecosystem multifunctionality, so the overall picture of the ecosystem functioning, we saw the same trend. So in the north there was less ecosystem functioning compared to the south. For Madagascar, we also saw a lot of spatial variation in terms of where these functions were happening, but unlike Sweden, we didn't really see a clear spatial pattern here. And there you can see the ecosystem multifunctionality spread in space. Again, there was not such a clear north to south, for example, gradient like we saw in Sweden. Then, as I mentioned, of course, we wanted to know why are these functions differing in space. So to start with Sweden, as I said here, we saw for at least some of the functions and also the overall functionality, we saw lower rates of ecosystem functions in the north compared to the south. This could be because, for example, it's a bit colder in the north, of course, compared to the south. There may be different vegetation types. Leaf litter depths may be different. This can cause different kinds of functionalities. And the soil moisture can, of course, also differ in space. So these were all the environmental variables that I checked in a model to see if I could explain these spatial differences of the functions. And of course, I looked at insect biodiversity, if this could explain the different functionalities at the different sites. So here's the result. I will just walk you through this kind of complicated graph. So here you can see the different environmental variables that I looked at, the temperature, soil moisture, vegetation cover, and leaf litter. In the middle, insect biodiversity, since this can of course also be affected by the environment. And then here on the right, the ecosystem functions and how they are affected by these variables. So just to point out some of the interesting patterns that I found. Here, so the arrows of course give the effects from one to the other. The thicker the arrow, the stronger the effect, and the red arrows indicate negative effects. So in Sweden, temperature has a relatively big effect on ecosystem function. So you see some fat arrows going from temperature to 3 out of the 5 functions. So the warmer it was, the more of these functions were happening at those sites. On the other hand, and I should also mention that temperature also affected the insect biodiversity. On the other hand, the insect biodiversity in turn had kind of a little effect on ecosystem functions in Sweden. And then we saw the same trend for ecosystem multifunctionality. So here you see a fat arrow going from temperature to ecosystem multifunctionality. So this was a very important force. Same for temperature to insect biodiversity, but then insect biodiversity has a relatively little effect on the ecosystem multifunctionality. And then, of course, why do they differ in Madagascar? Same approach here. I checked different kinds of environmental variables that we thought that might be important, and insect biodiversity. So here, same type of graph, but different arrows. So I will again point out some interesting results here. Contrary to what we saw in Sweden, actually in Madagascar, biodiversity had a very large impact on these different functions. So here 3 out of 5 functions were affected by insect biodiversity, and as you can see, the arrows are pretty thick, so there's a pretty strong effect here. Whereas temperature has a much smaller effect. It only affected few of the functions, and sometimes even it had a negative effect on, for example, seed dispersal. On the other hand, temperature could indirectly affect these functions by affecting insect biodiversity. So here the warmer the temperature, the more diversity there was, and then this in turn affects the functions that are happening at those sites. So for ecosystem multifunctionality, we saw the same pattern. The biggest effect came from insect biodiversity a smaller effect from temperature, but temperature had this indirect effect on ecosystem multifunctionality in Madagascar. And then I should mention that I checked different components of insect biodiversity, and here I saw that it was most important which kinds of species were present at the site. So not necessarily how many species, but more the types of species that influence the ecosystem functions. So some take-home messages. In Sweden, we saw that the warmer sites had higher ecosystem function rates, whereas biodiversity was a bit less important here. And in Madagascar, on the other hand, insect biodiversity was the most important factor in determining ecosystem functioning, where the identity of the species mattered the most. And as I mentioned before, these findings are important to predict future changes in ecosystem functioning in relation to, for example, climate change and the biodiversity crisis that we are currently experiencing. And this was it. I'm happy to take any questions in the break if you want to talk to me about these results. Thank you so much.